right, good morning, church. There you go. A little louder. That was weak as weak could be. There you go. Come on, we're in this together. There you go. Let's be a people, huh? All right, so we are in a series called God in the Ruins. We're studying the book of Nehemiah. If you have a Bible, go to the book of Nehemiah. Use that table of contents. Don't feel bad. It's a tiny little book. Also, if you don't have a Bible, we will hook you up. That is what we will do. So let's go into that. We're in Nehemiah chapter 4 this morning. This message is entitled The Conflict Management of Nehemiah. Great. Because you know this, if you have ever worked anywhere, the workplace is pretty conflicted. So here's some statistics to help us feel that. According to a 2021 survey conducted by the Harvard Business School, 89% of employees report experiencing conflict at work. And 3.5 hours per week are spent by employees dealing with conflict at work. That's pretty substantial. Let's also look at this. Different survey by CPP Global. These are the people behind the Myers-Briggs assessment. So when people are in conflict, this is how they deal with conflict. This is how they reported they deal with it. 89% let conflicts escalate. 67% took extra measures to avoid a colleague with whom they have a disagreement. 29% took several days to resolve the conflict. 24% avoided social events with colleagues that they were in conflict with. 12% quit their jobs. 10% avoided going to meetings. 9% avoided coming to work for multiple days. And then they also did a kind of an extrapolation or estimate that about $400 billion in costs related to workplace conflict happen each year. You have a lot of lost productivity and especially turnover of employees, which have to be trained in again. So conflict is a pretty big thing, not only for the bottom business, kind of the bottom line of a business, but also just human flourishing in general. So you will have conflict if you work in any workplace. It's true, you're going to have conflict if you live in any family, or even if you live in a neighborhood, sooner or later there's some conflict. Because we're humans and we're there. The issue is not whether there'll be conflict, the issue is how's it dealt with. So we study Nehemiah because it offers to us biblical wisdom about how to manage conflict in a different way than the world does. And if there's any sort of wisdom here, because conflict is so costly, I think it's worth giving a serious look to how Nehemiah deals with this conflict. So here's what drives a lot of conflict. No. Next slide. There we go. I call it the fire cycle. I made this up, but I think it bodes well. So oftentimes when there's conflict in a workplace, imagine yourself, you've been in workplaces where there's been conflict, somebody's bringing blame or some sort of criticism to a worker. Now, oftentimes, if both people are fighty personalities, that worker is going to bring it right back in blow-for-blow conflict escalation. That can happen. So you get that kind of cycle, just continues to escalate, and the root issues aren't addressed because it's just a really emotional conflict, blow for blow, back and forth. Or, and this happens more if that worker is more passive. They probably are not going to go back to the person with blow-for-blow conflict interaction. They're going to go to triangulate it with allies. We talked about this last week. So it's going to go then into a coworker. Let me create an ally against this person, probably the boss, and let's do a bunch of character assassinations and ally action against this person. Well, you know that's going to create more toxicity in the culture because you're just going to loop that conflict around. Now, this person has an issue with the critic when they didn't before. Allies, Axis powers. The fire cycle just continues to feed itself. It's putting more gas on that fire rather than getting into what the issues of that conflict are and addressing it, which is like water on the fire. So that's how conflict works in most workplaces. You can think about your own workplace. You can think about yourself too when you receive that criticism. Maybe it was totally unfair. What did you do with it? Did you blow for blow with the person? Well, you suck. Or did you fire cycle it in the way of triangulation? Probably that, because we like doing that, and most of us have a problem with direct confrontation. So how did that work? Well, I think Nehemiah offers us an example of a different way to process conflict. That's why we're going to study him. So let's go into a quick background of The book of Nehemiah, we've done this before. Let's do it again. So here we go. In the 6th century BC, because the nation of Israel turned their back on God over and over and over again, he removed his protection around them and let the nation of Babylon come in, Nebuchadnezzar, hammer the city, break down its walls, and take the elite, the Jewish elite, away to exile. Nehemiah, 100 years later, is still in exile. He's a cupbearer for the king, King Artaxerxes, the most powerful king on the planet. He uses his close access to the king to request the king allow him to return to Jerusalem and rebuild those city walls. And the king agrees. So Nehemiah, with his armed bodyguard, goes 800 miles back to Jerusalem to build the walls. So that's where we pick it up. He is going back, and the wall building has started. I've had one wall building experience in my life. It was here in Haiti. Next slide. This isn't working as per usual. So, stick with me, Devin. Okay, this is in Haiti. There was a lady named Brianna. She was a physician's assistant. After the earthquake in 2010, just days after, she used her connections to draw a bunch of medical professionals together. She was a convener to go to Haiti and provide trauma care, and included were part-time EMTs, which I was one. So we went to Haiti. But one of the things that we did in this orphanage we stayed in, and I'm right there, look at that, little head right there. We went and we didn't do the clinics right away. We actually rebuilt the walls around the orphanage. Because without walls and a chaotic culture, there's no security for the vulnerable. So we went there. And these are diverse people. No one's a professional bonded wall builder, right? It's a diverse group. You've got a cop, a farmer, a pastor, a maintenance man, a nurse, really eclectic group of people. But we all got after the work because the urgency of the work was so real that although none of us were necessarily skilled in that, we all were willing to sweat down to our underwear to build this wall, because without security, without that wall around these vulnerable kids, there's danger. So when Nehemiah comes to Jerusalem, no one's wall building yet, but he as a master convener is able to call a diverse group of people together to build the wall. And chapter 3, we're not going to read, but it lists who these people are. You have priests, you have perfume makers, you have government officials, you have goldsmiths, you have farmers, you have shepherds, diverse group of people. But they pick up the trowel and they start bricking the wall and they scoop up the rubble and get after the work. And they make good progress where we pick it up. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 6. Here's what it says. So we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to do the work. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward, and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. And we prayed to our God and set a guard as protection against them day and night. So Nehemiah and the wall builders are totally surrounded by their enemies, incredibly surrounded. Here with the Arabs, the Ammonites, the Horonites, and also right here, Ashdod. So they're completely surrounded by enemies who don't want them to do what they want to do, who God has called them to be and the work he's called them to do. So they have these hungry beasts around them that bare their teeth but have not bitten them yet. And then verse 9 is a power verse in this section right here. It's a repeated pattern of how Nehemiah deals with conflict. First, when he gets conflict or criticism or threats, he doesn't blow for blow trade it back with his enemies. Never does that. He always brings it to God first in prayer. See, his conflict is filtered. Remember the fire cycle? It has no filter. So even before he brings it to God's people, he first brings that frustration to God, which is always the right way. Because otherwise, if you bring your conflict directly even to good people, you will just dump on them. And it's a heavy load to carry. So first he brings his frustration to God. And God can handle all our frustrations, all our rage, all our confusion, all of our doubt, everything. He's the right first ear for our conflict. So he brings it to them, to God, and then he brings it to God's people. And you see that right there. This blue space is where we're camping out today. That is the area, that's the space where good work And the wisdom of conflict management is done right here, right in that space. So he prays about it, we see that before, and then he brings it to God's people, and that's what he's saying they did. And we prayed to our God and set a guard as protection against them day and night. We prayed to our God. It's interesting because in chapter 3, you can see that there's a group of priests that are on the work crew, but they don't outsource their prayer to the pros, which is always a mistake, right? We prayed together as a people. We did the work in this space together. Let's press into God together, because you don't want a pro outsourcing that prayer work for you. And they don't. And Nehemiah doesn't let it happen. It's like, let's go to God together. Because they all feel anxious. They all need that work together in prayer, in that space. This is their workspace. So they do that. They go to God together. Shared prayer is the first priority for a work project, a community praying and working together. And notice that they're not just a holy huddle that prays. In the light of their prayer, then they work strategically. We set a guard as protection against them day and night. That's right. Prayer fuels our work. It's not in place of our work. We work in the light of our prayer. So that's what they do. And let's see what happens. They need to, too, because the threats and gossip are about to happen. Verse 10, in Judah, that's the region outside the city, it was said, the strength of those who bear the burden is failing. There's too much rubble. By ourselves, we will not be able to rebuild the wall. And our enemies said, they will not know or see it till we come among them and kill them and stop the work. At that time, the Jews who lived near our enemies came from all directions and said to us 10 times, you must return to us, leave the city, right? That's the idea. So in the lowest parts of the space between the wall, or behind the wall, in open places, I stationed the people by their clans with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. And fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. So all the noise, all the threats, all the gossip is happening outside the city. It's not actually happening among the people that are doing the real work. And that can happen in workplaces. The people doing the work, they're just doing the work. And then there's the power line, verse 14. Do not be afraid. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. That's their space again right there. They're creating that echo chamber of God's promises. Hey, let's remember. It's not as if they had forgotten. We're in God's city doing God's work. Technically, they know that. But in conflict, it's easy to forget that. It isn't dynamically real to you. Right? Like most of us, if you're a follower of Christ, you know you have a heavenly Father. He's massively powerful. But in conflict, we forget that. That's why we need this echo chamber of people that can reflect the promises of God back to us. That's what Nehemiah is doing right there. Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is awesome and great. You need that echo chamber. That's why, as a church, we're so big into faith and work integration. Because most of your conflict is happening in some sort of workspace. That's where you spend a lot of your waking hours. So, we have to think about how do you master and manage conflict in that workspace that's very real and alive to you, when technically you might remember what you're about, but dynamically you forget. Well, an echo chamber really helps. And within vocation, that's why that's why we do fellows. That's why we have a standing offer. If you can create 2 other people inside your own vocation for a cohort, we'll resource that. 2 other people that do a vocation similar enough to yours. Doesn't mean they do the exact same form of sales, but they're in sales, or they teach, or whatever. If you can find 2 other people that are in a cohort with you in the vocation, very powerful. Because vocational insiders can speak the same language and speak the same God's truth to power and lies, where other people outside just can't quite do it the same way. That's powerful for a cohort. If you can create that, again, this is not rhetorical or a false promise. We will help resource you for that. We've done that a lot. So if you can create a cohort of 2 or more people, that's a critical mass. 3, that helps. We need that. Here's an example of what that looks like. So I do a little podcast with another guy, Jesse. We interviewed this teacher, Jake Bates. Veteran middle school teacher. Man, if you're a middle school teacher, you're something special. It's like the most awkward time in the planet for every human being. So if you purposely enter into that, you must have a calling for that. which I don't have. Right? Remember what we talked about? This space. You need to have people with you in this space who understand your calling because they share it. So here's Jake. He's a middle school teacher. And he feels called to this. And I asked him during the interview, I said, Jake, is it hard for you as a Christian, he's a Christian guy, working in a very secular environment to bring your faith to bear, right? And he said, nah, there's opportunities all the time. The kids know he's a person of faith, so sometimes they ask him about his faith, and he openly shares. And if some kid brings a Bible to study hall, he's like, here's what your Bible says. You introduced it. There's a whole bunch of ways that are creative to bring your faith to bear, even in a secular public school workspace. When there's a school shooting like there was some miles, just a few miles away from him, he's like, here's where my hope and peace comes. Guess what? When there's a real tragedy, those doorways open up. Or when there's a pandemic, he can say, here's where my hope and faith comes from. There's a whole bunch of creative space for that. And then he said this comment, I love it. He said this, you know what? Well, I served Jesus, and he was a servant, right? There's never an obstacle towards serving other people in the public school. See, that's great. Here's why. Because I don't really understand that space. It's not my vocation. So I don't understand, A, what are the threats and anxieties that are common to a person who's a Christian working in a public school? They need each other. Does that make sense? You have to be able to speak the promises of God to similar anxieties, and that happens in a vocational cohort. But also this, Jake is able to call out other Christian teachers who might use the excuse of a secular workspace to say, I can't really bring my work to bear. What he's saying there in the most cool way is, that's garbage. That's garbage. And you can only do that to a person who's in your vocation. I can't do that for you. Like, I'm not a public school teacher, so I can't say to you, though I may think it, that's garbage, man. You can always find an excuse to not do the will of God, or you can get about the business of building the wall right in front of you. Rather than decrying the culture and how secular it is and how it isn't in the 50s, it isn't. What's the work you can actually do now? Focus on that. Do the stuff in your lane. Jake can do that to other teachers, and he does. He's in a group of teachers. I'm in a group of ministers. We meet once a month, and we do that exact work. We're like, call out the promises of God over this vocation that we're called to. And sometimes we hold each other accountable to be like, hey, bro, that's not for you to do. So you say, I can't find other Christians in my cohort. I get that. But there's never a group until somebody convenes the group, and you might be the convener. And also, have you prayed about it? We'll pray with you. If you're like, I really want 2 other people who share my same vocation where we can do the work right here of the echo chamber of God's promises into the vocation we all feel called to. You can find it. We have a grandparents group, meets once a month, prays together. That's a vocational cohort. Doesn't matter if it's paid work. And guess what? We live in an era of technologies with incredible connectivity. If you can't find a group in your workplace, you may find a group in your community, or at least in the nation. Unless you do some really weird job, like I'm a professional candle maker or something, probably there's somebody in your workspace if you're the person that convenes it and says, hey, I'm not going to just complain that there aren't Christians in my vocation. I'm going to do something about convening them. There was no Haitian trip without Brianna as the convener. There's no one building the walls in Jerusalem without Nehemiah as a credible convener saying, come on, let's do this. Maybe that's your work. Let's do this. Maybe. Pray with you. Get started on it. Here's how our passage ends in the account of Nehemiah. When our enemies heard that it was known to us that God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall, each to his work. From that day on, half my servants worked on construction, and half held the spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah, who were building on the wall. Those who carried burdens were loaded in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand and held the weapon with the other. And each of the builders had his sword strapped at his side while he built. The man who sounded the trumpet was beside me. And I said to the nobles and to the officials and the rest of the people, the work is great and widely spread, and we are separated on the wall, far from one another. In the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us here. Our God will fight for us. There's your power line. Our God will fight for us. That may sound strange coming from a group of guys who have like swords, spears, armor, bows, who are really geared up, and at the same time we're saying, yeah, but our God will fight for us. It sounds like they're saying, well, we'll fight for us. We got this one, God. But it's true. They're saying, our God will do the fighting for us ultimately. It's good because it honors preparedness. Like they're ready for the work. They got their tools, they got their weapons. But at the same time, it acknowledges that even with all the workplace resources and skills and weaponry and tools and everything, God must work for that to be secured. It's a right dependency. He's like, I got skills. I mean, Nehemiah's a brilliant guy. Like, he didn't become third in the kingdom for no reason. So he's a brilliant guy. And he's got all this preparation ready and a master plan strategically put forward. But at the same time, he says, and our God will fight for us. That's that perfect balance of prayer and preparedness, planning and work. You need both those things to come together in a dovetail. They're not enemies, but definitely it's a dependency on God that leads. Our God will fight for us. And that is a big, big part of this space, because you have to remind yourself that you have a God. Again, like I said before, technically, if you're a follower of Christ, you know, I'm not alone. There is a God. He's my God. He's over this. He's got me. But you forget it in the moment. And within every vocation, there's anxieties to take an orphan mindset there. An orphan mindset, I tell you what, is going to, think of the conflicts you've been in at work at some point. I'm going to guess that oftentimes what's behind that is one or both parties are taking an orphan mindset into the work. It's a scarcity mindset. It's why you have to claw and grasp and be very competitive in order to feel like I'm okay. Because if I don't have a God, I must be the God there. So things are scarce. Money's scarce. Resources are scarce. I don't get what I deserve. I got to make sure I get what I deserve. Very competitive, very scarcity thinking, because that's how orphans think. I was in Haiti. Orphans have to watch out for themselves because there's no other person for you. You don't have a father. You're alone. Think of the workplace, man. So much conflict is pushed by an orphan mindset. I'm talking by non-Christians too. Like if you don't feel like you have a father, then you got to work pretty hard to get ahead of other people, to get mine before they get theirs, because there's only so much getting to go. Let me share a personal experience or kind of example of that. You don't know these statistics because none of you do this for a living. I do. But here's it. 4,500 churches close every year in America. Also, there is on our horizon what I call the baby boomer apocalypse. The most generous, religious giving generation is passing. Now, again, because I do this for a living, here's the reality. To do this work, I need nickels and noses. I need people. And in the back of my mind, there is that haunting fear. What if you can't do it? What if this church closes too? Right? Now, again, that's an in my vocation kind of anxiety that you don't have. Guess what? You just show up, mostly. But that's okay. You have your own vocations. You have your own anxieties. You have your own more orphan mindset that you can fall into. Everybody has an orphan mindset that they can fall and default into. And at the same time, you need a group of people that can echo back to you, you have a dad. He's awesome. He's super powerful. Like Nehemiah said, we have a great and awesome God. You have to have that reminder constantly brought to your foreground because it gets into the background and slips into the furniture and you forget that it's there. It's like the smell in your house. You forget it's there. But God is real. You have a father. An example of this week, Daniel and I were in the rec center, in the locker room, getting ready to swim. We're just like talking, I don't know, about toys or whatever. This guy comes up to us, never seen him before, red beard, 50 years old, comes up to us and he's like, I'd like to give your son something. He holds out a 20. I was like, well, I have other kids too. You stingy man. No, I was joking. I didn't say that. I was like, well, why? You know, why? He's like, I've just learned when God tells me to give something, I give it. And I was like, well, okay, cool. So he took the money. It was just, and it's only $20, but it was a reminder to me, like, God is never financially strapped. Like, if God wants to, he can move resources around like he wants to, right? It was just a reminder, like, you have a dad. You have a dad. Whatever scarcity is in your mind about the vocation you do, you have a dad. And I love the quote that Hudson Taylor, missionary to China, said, and it's applicable to us all because we're all missionaries on a mission field. He said this, God's work done in God's way never lacks God's supply. That is true because you have a dad. God's work, if you're actually doing the work God called you to do, and sometimes we're not in the right work because we want to do it, we have this fantasy about it, but we're actually not doing the work we were created to do. But if you're in that sweet spot, God's work, done in God's way with his integrity, never lacks God's supply. It's up to God to keep us in our jobs. It's his job to keep me at the job. I'm going to do it well. I'm going to do it as unto the Lord. But at the end of the day, if he wants me to keep doing this job, it's up to you. Your dad, not me. God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supply. That's rock solid. That's a promise you got to echo around. We have a God. He will fight for us. I am not an orphan. I'm not all on my own. On my own, hitchhiking through the world. You have to be reminded of that. God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supplies. You have a dad. Unless you're not a Christian, you do not have a dad. You should feel alone because you're trying to operate as your own God in this world. You don't need to. Let him take over. Let him fill that space. Because if you're not going to be an orphan, you got to be adopted. There's only two options. And it's through Christ we're adopted. Ephesians 1:5. It's what we celebrate at the table. We're about to celebrate the adoption. In love, God predestined us for adoption to himself as sons and daughters through Jesus Christ, according to the purpose of his will, to the praise of his glorious grace, which he has blessed us in the beloved. He adopts people in. He creates families.